Friends and colleagues, thanks to 21st century technology, we have finally tapped time travel. Some of you here at GGBC might remember a few years ago when we actually met together in person that Miss Florence Nightingale visited us in the flesh. Well, now that we have a pandemic, she's agreed to drop in on our Zoom meeting. So let's give a warm GGBC welcome to the polymath, the icon of the nursing profession, Miss Florence Nightingale. Miss Nightingale, do you hear me?
Hello, hello. Oh,
Hey,
you're in the corner. Let me see. Let me see if I can find you in right in front of me here. Oh, that's better. Now, hello. So lovely to see you. Thank you so much for inviting me back to be your guest again. And look, you presenters have given me this lovely place to wait. And well, there's a gramophone. I've been feeling quite at home.
well, thank you. Glad you could join us today, Miss Nightingale. You look fabulous all the way from what year was it that you're coming from?
Oh, well, I was born in 1820.
Oh, you look marvelous.
Well, thank you. You see, that is the benefit of rejuvenation from the heavenly realm. Mm.
Well, great. Well, today we're going to be asking you some questions that we've compiled from our listeners and other folks who are interested in finding out more about you. So, Miss Nightingale, you probably know we're in the midst of a pandemic. Did you ever experience a pandemic? And if so, what do you think about our frontline workers, especially in healthcare, that are serving at the risk of their lives?
Well, that seems to be two questions. Let me see. In regard to the healthcare workers serving at risk of our lives, that is what we take on as a definition of healthcare worker. We are conscripted as soldiers, so to speak, fighting death and disease. That is what we do. Now, in terms of pandemic, it is dreadful, but this is nothing new. Disease has followed mankind since, well, we don't know. History is rife with different sorts of pandemic. And you ask, had I experienced? Well, I will tell you, not only once, but twice. Yes. Well, first, we thought at the time it was an epidemic in London. 1853, I was serving in my very first post as an actual professional nurse in Harley Street, the laying-in hospital for gentle women in unforeseen circumstances. Yes. And the cholera epidemic was upon us. So I used my moral authority and analysis and volunteered with the health authorities to supply another ward for the sick. So we converted our maternal hospital into a cholera ward. Now, scrolling ahead to the next year, 1854, when the Crimean War broke out and the Sidney Herbert, Minister of the War, asked me to take a bevy of nurses, professional nurses that I had trained, over to Turkey, where we had the Barracks Hospital. I spoke to that to your group about that experience last time I was here. But for the benefit of those who don't know about that, let me just say that there were 38 of us nurses. There were 18 Sisters of Mercy and 20 of us others. They were all handpicked, trained by me because, in my day, they needed to be literate. That was a challenge. And we went to Scutari. And what do you think we found? The old enemy, cholera, once again. Well, there were certain reasons for it. Cholera being an infection spread by the contaminant in fecal matter happens when people bathe or use water inordinately. Now, it evidently, history tells us this particular pandemic began in 1847 in the Ganges of India. And then you see it spread because travel was slower in those days, spread to England, 53. And well, who knows how long it had been in Turkey, but we certainly met it there. Well, why, you might ask? Well, we found that the Barracks Hospital was built atop a cesspool, indeed. And not only that, the disgusting disease was spread even more violently because, as we found out, there was a dead horse on it in the cesspool. It was dreadful, I tell you. So there, Sidney Herbert and I were battling internally also with the pride and the prejudice of the physician staff who were, well, I believe they were afraid of crying out for help, that they would be perceived as incompetent. Well, definitely incompetent, as they were, useless with this illusion of success. It only destroyed the men. It was some time before we were able to clean out the filth, and then accordingly, wouldn't you know, the death rate from disease dropped nearly immediately. Now, you, in your time, you, as you say, are at war with another pandemic. This is, I hear, a deadly virus. Well, I would say it's shocking to me that in your modern society, I realize that things like cholera are still prevalent in backward, shall we say, Bronze Age societies, or places where it's difficult to build proper sanitation. But in your country, an abundance of wealth. It is amazing to me that the healthcare authorities, who know that disease and epidemics, indeed possibly a pandemic if it spreads all over, would be ripe for the happening, and would not provide accordingly a savings account, if you will, for the future. And I do hope that that will be a lesson, that and washing your hands.
Yes, washing our hands, that's a big thing that we do. And before we go to the next question, I know a lot of people here are having thoughts about ideas that they want to ask questions about during this presentation. So I'm going to ask them to put a single question, single line question in the chat, and we'll ask those to you once we get finished with my questions from the others that have asked questions and presented them to me. So just want to let everybody know you can put a message, or it's not a message, but a question in the chat for Miss Nightingale. So as we get through and get into the question and answer period. Now, Miss Nightingale, because of the pandemic, we hear that a lot of our nurses and frontline workers are really burned out. It's been, a lot of long hours, and of course, being in some of those situations can be quite sad, watching people, succumb to the virus and stuff. So some are even leaving the profession. What can we do to help, these frontline workers?
Well, let me say, in the first place, this is not unusual. It's exhausting, mentally, physically, spiritually. In my case, I cannot think of any of the nurses that I worked with in the Crimea, in Scutari, who, when the war was finished, continued as nurses. They were spent. This is not unusual for nurses who are at war. Now, based on what you say, those healthcare workers, all of them are at war. The loneliness, the seclusion, the needing to be 24/7 or at the bedside, if you will, all the time. We often say that the struggle first is internal. and that we must take time to rejuvenate ourselves. It's very difficult when there is so much need, and we are so dedicated because, it is our integrity that gives us the agency to do the work that we do. And we take the sadness home with us. In my case, it took years to sort of shed the memories. I believe you might call that post-traumatic stress. And it's to be expected. But on the external, aside from providing more education for more nurses and other healthcare workers to be provided, of course, we need the money for that, for education. I would say that in the throes of the pandemic, those healthcare leaders need to show leadership in a way that perhaps they had not done. And what do I mean? Well, I say they must be present, not secluding themselves behind doors in meetings, heavens. No, they must be walking around, lending a hand, encouraging, giving generous praise, being cautious with criticism, and being succinct in their communication. And we, knowing what they are going through as a profession, doing what we can to support them, being patient and understanding that it is a heavy burden to bear the sadness of these families. Mm-hmm. I myself, all of us there, had many times when because there was no family there, we sat at the bedside. We wrote letters home. We encouraged the sick and the dying, telling them that they had fought the good fight and giving them hope. It is a dreadful burden to carry, so being understanding and patient, I think, is what you can do.
Okay. That's good advice that we all need to do. Be patient with healthcare workers and cheer them on. So the healthcare in the world is, really suffering with this particular pandemic as well. As in general, we have issues with healthcare in a lot of areas. How can healthcare be improved?
In the macrocosm, as I've mentioned, provide for the supplies for a rainy day, as it were. That's very important. And I think all of us must realize the fact that public health and sanitation are inexorably linked, Mm-hmm. And that goes back to individually. We can wash our hands and keep our places clean. Don't be hoarding materials and causing disease to swell up. I think also, I said in healthcare, we must be compassionate for others, but here's something. Some people I know go into healthcare with the idea that it will be steady work. And that is not a good reason. The emotional burden is just too heavy. We must have compassion, yes, and as a society, we must have compassion, but we must be caring. Now, there is a difference. Those of you, whether at home or in a clinical situation, we must be carers, yes, but caring. And what is the difference between compassion and caring? Well, anyone who studied English grammar would know compassion is a noun. It is thoughts and words, but caring is a verb. It indicates movement. Yes, we must be action-oriented. Don't just sit idle. Do what you can. Volunteer.
Thank you. Now, Miss Nightingale, you are well known to our audience as the person who established the first school of nursing after you served in the Crimean War in the 1850s. I'd like to ask you about your travels. There's another author who wrote a fictional account of you and Gustave Flaubert in Egypt. Is that true?
Heavens, no. Oh, heavens, no. I suppose you might make the assumption that because evidently we both did travel to Egypt approximately the same time, that perhaps our paths crossed. But I will tell you, had that been the case, why, he was a known rake. I was a single woman, 29 years old, with chaperones. Yes, the Bracebridges, family friends. Selina, I called her Sigma, was like a surrogate mother to me, and they were accountable to my parents. They would never have allowed that sort of social intercourse, if you know my meaning. They, but might I tell you a story?
Please, please.
Might I to Egypt?
Please.
Oh, well, first I must tell you, this was beginning in 1849, and I had been called, I believed, to do something with my life that was different than other expectations of the Victorian woman. You know, as women, we were in the aristocracy or the gentrified classes. We had nothing to do in our lives. We dibble dabble in charitable works, but our gifts were not developed. And moreover, for those women who had no means, who needed a way to make a living, they had no means other than the oldest profession, if you get my drift. My object, I believed, was to learn what I could about establishing this new profession of nursing. And so in the previous 10 years, when I had confided to my parents that I wanted to become a nurse, they were very upset. They considered that a servile avocation and something that was well beneath our position in society. So they tortured us off, my sister and I, to the great places in Europe to sort of divert our attention, well, my attention at any rate. And it solidified my need to find out as much as I could about healthcare administration. So you see, in those 10 years, I had traveled throughout the UK, learning, studying, gathering information about how best to supervise or build a nursing profession. And after that time, well, I was depressed. I seemed to be in an impasse. My parents would not allow me to do anything. And so there we were. And one night at dinner, my mother pressed me again about being married. And, you know, it's not that I didn't have a chance to be married, but I knew that no gentleman of my time would allow his wife to work in the way that I envisioned it. And so I gave up that idea, and I knew that I had a calling to do and be something different. So when I had a bit of a breakdown that night, Selina and I went for a walk in the garden, and she encouraged me. She said, "My dear, I know that God has provided you with some gifts. We don't know how we can help you, but Mr. B and I have an idea. We'd like to help you. With your parents' permission, we'd like to take you on a little journey, a trip with us to explore Netherlands. We thought it might be jolly to go to Egypt." And I said, "Egypt?" Now, mind you, Egypt in the 1850s was the same as, well, I dare say, San Francisco. It was the Wild West of the East. It was very exciting, very primitive, and very far from my parents. And so we set out. And now, in the interim, of course, we traveled from England down through France, a bit of Spain, and then over to Italy, down to Greece, and then we arrived in Egypt. And Oh, well, let me say, I loved being in Europe. Oh, the joys of the culture there. The civilization had flourished in these places. And then we arrived in Egypt. It was something totally different, I tell you. This cradle of civilization was barren. And it was, well, it was brown. The Nile was brown, the sand was brown, the people were brown, and everything was brown. And desolation. I had seen poverty. Oh yes. In England, I had seen poverty. In Sicily, I thought was terribly poverty. But this was like nothing we had ever seen. Oh, people homeless, so poor they were living in caves and catacombs.
Mm.
And the beauty I saw there was in the sky. Oh, the bluest blue during the day, bluer than Greece. And I thought the Grecian sky was blue. And at night, oh, the ebony sky with an infestation of stars like nothing I had ever seen. It made perfect sense to me then why the poverty in Egypt, those people, they understood hope and they grasped the idea of a life after death. Oh, but moreover, this journey solidified my idea that I must return to the UK and I must create a way, a new nursing profession. And you see, the rest is history.
Mm. Literally. For us. Oh, that's great. Well, thank you for that great story about Egypt, and it must have been a fascinating time to be, able to travel around the world and see the places back then. We all think that that would be the good old days, maybe, but it sounds like perhaps not in some cases. So, Miss Nightingale, we have a lot of questions from our audience members from our club, and one of the first questions I think our president of our club, Craig Adams, asked was, can you tell us a little bit more about that medal you wear?
Oh, yes. When I was visiting your club a few years ago, a nice gentleman provided me with this medal from the Crimean conflict. It was from Sebastopol, and I wear it with pride. Living in the heavenlies as I do, I'm not sure where they got this particular earthly body. It is not precisely the same as the one I had, but all the medals and the wonderful Victorian cross that I had, well, it was lost. And so I was so pleased that when I was with the Golden Gate Breakfast Club, I was provided with this, and I wear it with pride whenever I'm beamed down to the earth.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. That's good to hear. I did not know that. So, Miss Nightingale, Patricia Fripp, all of our members are esteemed, but one of our esteemed members apparently knows you. She says, good to see you again. And in your time, did your nurses receive the respect they deserved?
Well, no, actually. You see, in the times past, women who were conscripted, if you will, to be in the nursing profession are one of two types. Of course, firstly, they were nuns. Now, they had no formal training, but they were good in their work because they were compassionate, and they knew, they learned the skills needed to a certain extent to take care of patients. But most of the women who were nurses in the workhouses, which was a terrible thing, a whole other discussion, they were, as you will, conscripted to work as nurses because there was no one else. And so As the fact was, many were imprisoned in the workhouses because they were desolate and had been women of the streets, if you will. And so there were two sorts, but the ones who were known to be nurses before our nursing profession, started by me, were not in the best of esteem in the general community, which is another reason my parents did not want me doing the work.
I see that. That's very interesting. Now, Tom Kowalski asked, in the Crimea, what did you use for disinfecting?
Well, there was alcohol and there was soap and water, very little else. As I recall, there might have been some peroxide that doctors had. You know, in terms of iodine, yes, we had iodine. In terms of medications, to go on that drift, I will tell you, there was a little morphine. We had no morphine. Sometimes it was used very sparingly. We had chloroform, but that also was used very sparingly. And let me tell you, surgeries, there was no, in our barracks hospital, you see, it was built 100 years prior as the stables for the Sultan. And when it was turned into a barracks, there was no operating theater. No, there were no operating tables, anything of the sort. The surgeries, the amputations and all, were done on the wards in front of the men.
Oh.
And rarely would they even use the chloroform. They didn't want to waste it.
That's a shame. You kind of mentioned marriage and being unmarried and choosing the life that you chose, but Susan Rowan asked, in your era, were nurses expected to be unmarried?
Well, certainly the nuns, yes. But yes, they were actually. I found in my work with nurses in Scutari that they, well, of course, like I said, they had been trained by me, and we had strict rules of no fraternization with men. It was necessary. Now, that said, I had need to, if you will, expel one or two for problems that came, I suppose, with the depression of being so emotionally overwhelmed. Some were, well, one in drunkenness and another was pregnant. So it behooved me to ask the women to be not only of sound mind and body, but unmarried, so as not to let's say, confuse their objectives.
I see. Okay. Now, Janice Litvin, one of our members, also said that she read that you were one of the early adopters of the value of the sun in healing your patients. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Oh, yes. Well, vitamin D was unknown to me, certainly, but it seems so logical to walk about, deeply respirate, sit in the sun. These are, the sun has cleansing value, and we know now that it dries up the bacteria and so forth. The sun is very good. In fact, when I arrived in Scutari, they had shut the windows because the air, the outside air, was said to bring in the disease. But I said, when should the windows be shut? Well, no, the real question is, why ever should they be shut? Certainly if it's thundering outside, but they should be mostly open and purify the putrefaction inside. The sun and the air are nature's gifts to our health.
Excellent. So Craig Adams, our president, asked again another question, which is really interesting because in your travels in celebrity, did you ever run into Will Rogers?
No. Mr. Rogers was, I was long gone by the time he arrived on the earth.
Yeah, probably a good thing. Probably a good thing. But well, great. One last question for you before you leave us, and I would like to call our your channeler, Candy Campbell, and give you a break to go back to where you're normally resting. And you know, Miss Nightingale, what advice would you give us during the time of a pandemic?
When I've mentioned wash your hands, that is definitely a staple.
Mhm.
But I would say simply go with kindness. Seize the day with the most important thing is to do unto others with kindness.
Great. Thank you so much. And is Miss Campbell around there today? Could we get a
Yes,
chance to
yes.
meet Miss
One
Campbell? Thank
moment.
you for joining us. We appreciate you coming and joining us here at the club. Again, second time, and hopefully again in the future, we'll get to have your presence here.
And
And
I'm
then,
enormously grateful for the opportunity to visit with you today. And now I'll turn it over to my friend, Dr. Campbell.
hey, so good to see you there, Candy, Dr. Candy Campbell, everybody. We do have a question from Patricia Fripp, one of your good friends from the NSA.
Yes.
And she asked, what is your process to get into character?
Well, I've been a trained actor for many, many years, and classically trained. And so Stanislavski method was the first that I studied, and then the Meisner method. And it's a little different from Lee Strasberg and that method. And so first of all, I suppose it's delving into the character, learning as much as I can. It's really bothering my hair is all over the place, but oh well. Yeah, learning as much as I can about the character. Miss Nightingale wrote so much. She left it with us with so much. She has 200 books and articles and over 10,000 letters, and I made a study of it. And for those of you who don't know, I tell the story in my book, Channeling Florence Nightingale, about the fact that I was so enamored of her. I just found she was like a soulmate. In 2010, all of these writings got to be online. And I was a professor then at the School of Nursing in University of San Francisco. And our librarian came in and said, hey, you guys, you should know that you can access this and it's free. And so I did, and I started with one, and I just kept reading and reading and reading. And then, as it turned out, I was at an NSA party, a Christmas or holiday party, and Barry Wishner heard me talking about this. And he said, wait a minute, let me get this straight. You're all on fire about how you really esteem this Florence Nightingale gal who did so much and all of that. And I'm like, yeah, that's really right. She's really amazing. And he said, and you're a nurse. But of course, yeah, I'm a nurse. And he goes, and you're an actor and you've had 2 solo shows so far. And I'm like, well, yeah. And he goes, and why isn't this your 3rd show? And I'm like, so I always say Barry was the inspiration, because he called me the next day and said, as he's wont to do, and said, "You really going to do this?" I'm like, "Okay, I'll do it."
Very cool. Yeah, I met Barry. I can see him doing that and pulling that out of you, and that's a good thing. So, are all of your speeches as Miss Nightingale, or do you deliver presentations as you, Dr. Candy Campbell?
Oh, yeah. Because, the other thing, I've got 2 sort of things that I do. I do Miss Nightingale. And then as an actor and as an academic, I sort of blended the art and science. And I've written a book and I lecture on improv in healthcare. Well, I'll have to tell you, years ago in the early 90s, I was a co-founder of an improv troupe in the San Francisco East Bay. And it was called the Barely Insane Players, and there were 4 of us. And in 1995, one fellow, I don't remember his last name, his first name was Michael, came up to us after a show and asked, so you guys must have practiced that some. And we said, no, it's improv, right? And he said, well, in that case, could you come to my company and could you show my engineers how to play nice? And so that was, as it turned out, I was the only one who had ever had curriculum development. I had a minor in education. And so that startup then got subsumed by Google years later. But I started there in Silicon Valley teaching improv to businesses. And still now I do it virtually. It's very interesting. And let me just say, the Improv to Improve Healthcare is the first of 4 books that I'm writing on healthcare, and they've just been picked up by Business Expert Press. So very excited about that.
Well, that's exciting. Yeah, very good. Do you have time for any more questions from the audience if they wanted to ask before you have to leave? Okay. I don't have any more questions in the chats. Does anybody want to ask a single question to Candy, Dr. Campbell here? You can unmute yourself and ask real quick. Craig?
I have a question, Candy. Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. That was great. You know, and you get caught up in the spirit of Florence. So I thought your performance was just superlative. So thank you so much. Have you, just out of curiosity, have you ever visited the Crimea or gone to Sevastopol? Has that ever been on your radar?
Oh, it's been on my list, but I haven't been able to get there. By the time, I don't know, I wanted to go to Greece first, and I wanted to go back to London. I lived in London for 2 years, but I wanted to go back and see some of the haunts that had to do with healthcare in Florence, and I did that. But no, it's on my list. It's not exactly a place that a lot of people can go right now.
Yeah, the Crimea is kind of out of the way, isn't it?
Well, Crimea, no, she went to Sevastopol once, but that's in the Ukraine. So yeah. No, not going. I don't think.
Candy, Patricia Fripp, great job. You obviously sound like a total overachiever with all your background. Now, personally, what I would like to know is a couple of words on each of the acting philosophies. And then, if nobody else asked, I would like you to give us a couple of techniques that your improv group taught super straight engineers and people in Silicon Valley.
Okay, well, let me start with the improv one. One of the principles, and I've outlined, acting and improv, it's sort of amorphous, you can read different books, different people have different ideas. And so I sort of did, in my mind, an amalgamation of what I thought was important when I was teaching it, not necessarily for performance, because that's different. So in terms of getting interprofessionals, inter or intra-professional communication to get going, I feel that the yes and principle is the most important, as opposed to the yeah, but, because yeah, but sounds like a yes, but it's not really a yes, it's really a roadblock. So allowing people to do these exercises of getting it in your mind, it's kind of like, the old idea that you can't unring a bell. And then another one is making your partner look good. Now, what does that mean in real life? It means that you listen well, and your goal is that it's kind of like in some cultures, like the Asian cultures, they wouldn't be rude like people are on Twitter. They wouldn't be rude. They would be kind to each other because you don't want to disgrace anyone. Why? Well, because it's bad for business and it's bad for interprofessional relationships if you can't at least give a face of being kind, and it opens you up to relationship, which is really the bedrock of improv. And that gets into a couple of the what I mentioned, the different you asked about the different philosophies of acting. So Stanislavski, Russian, and he pulled away from the 19th century mode of acting, which was kind of like stand and deliver, blah, 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 blah. You're a post and you have a speech, and it went away from what I understand from my readings was the Shakespearean way of acting, which included a lot of improv. And those actors, because they had the groundlings there, the poor seats, the cheap seats in the front and in the way back and everything. And then the aristocracy was around in the balconies. They had to play to so many audiences, and they were very lively. But then something happened, and by the 1800s, they, like I said, stand and deliver, and they gave Shakespeare kind of a bad name, or any of those classical speeches that they would make. They would just, blah, 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 in beautiful elocution, but not really the heart and soul underneath the character. So Stanislavski, as a Russian, they say that the Russian people are very emotional. And he said, we need to forget all this stand and deliver stuff. We need to put ourselves in the shoes of another person. And then Meisner, and Lee Strasberg, also two people who were from the Stanislavski school of acting. The Lee Strasberg school, the method acting, they say that if you, when you're putting yourself in another person's shoes, if you are directed by the script to come up with an emotion and it's hard for you night after night after night, what you should do is like trick yourself. You should think of something like, let's say you've got to cry, and let's say you remember, when your dog died, and then you remember and you go into that. It's a very personal thing, and you will indeed maybe cry on stage. The problem with that, as I see it, is what Meisner saw with it, is that if you're doing that night after night, your brain has a way of numbing you to the effect, and pretty soon it won't be effectual, and you have to find another horrible thing in your life, But Meisner said, the reality of acting is the act of doing. So that if you're supposed to be perplexed because you have nothing in your bank account and you're supposedly writing a check, you should actually write the check, not pretend to write the check. You should actually think of what was happening 15 minutes before the script begins, and imagine in your life. It's the way I've done it when I've been in other plays where the script is written by someone else, and I had to actually come forth with that emotion maybe 8 times a week. And that's a little bit more challenging, but it worked. I believe me, being empathetic and compassionate to the character, because I created the 15 minutes before. And then when my mind started numbing even to that creation, I went back even further and got deeper and deeper and deeper into the character. I'm thinking now of a mother who's, had a terrible thing happen in her family. And it worked because it allowed me to be true and not just lying, if you will. Like one of my students once said, you're just a good liar. But that's not it. In fact, let me just add one more thought. I often tell my nurses who are surprised that I came from an acting background. I said, nursing and acting have something in common, and that is we study the human condition, and we want to know exactly what it is that caused this person in healthcare to get to this position. Why are they here before you? What's their history, social as well as medical? And as an actor, we we cover all of that. We do a thorough analysis as much as we can of the character. So that's probably too much, but anyway, thanks for the question.
No, thank you very much, Candy. Tom Kowalski asked a question about Florence, and if you can answer this, you may have to wait till you channel Florence again. But did Florence use leeches to close wounds, or to help with that?
No, the doctors did, but she did not.
Okay.
One of those things that I learned from her is that she was a great questioner. And sometimes those things seem to be effectual, but many times it wasn't. So it's another reason she wasn't popular, because she used her intuition to just ask subjectively and objectively and gather data. It's spawned what now we call evidence-based practice in healthcare. And it's all based on everything that she did, which she could only do because she had the education in the first place, the interest and the education to follow through, gather data. And then, she had mentors who were statisticians that helped her put it all together.
That's great. Thank you so much, Candy. I think you mentioned you had to leave about this time. So any other questions or advice you'd like to give?
Advice I'd like to give?
Yeah, do you have any parting advice?
No, I think everybody's doing fine with washing their hands and keeping social distancing. And hopefully, I don't know, I've been vaccinated as a healthcare worker, and I know there's a lot of flim-flam about whether or not you should be, but because the CDC and the FDA are behind the vaccinations, I'm all in. I hope you are.
All right. Thank you very much, Candy.
Thank you.
Appreciate you joining us today, and tell Miss Nightingale we said we appreciate her as well. Everybody give Candy a big round of applause.
Great job, Candy. Great
Thank
job.
you.
Yay
Thank
from
you.
your speaker pals.
Thank you,
so much.
Candy.
Thank you, Candy.